I want to discuss the topic of the threat of governments banning Bitcoin. This is a common criticism that is made of Bitcoin in terms of its value proposition. It is meant to be a sort of dagger in the heart of the investment thesis of Bitcoin. Oh, governments can ban it at any time, and therefore it is a bad investment, and therefore ignore Bitcoin. Now, in this video, I don't really want to get into why this criticism is in so many ways not in and of itself very valid. And what I mean by that is, first of all, you can't ban free and open software. Bitcoin is an open protocol. Anyone can download it. Anyone can download Bitcoin Core and run a full node. It is just endlessly propagating itself, endlessly copying copies of copies of copies of itself. You can't, that's not something that is, it's actually absurd and ludicrous to think that you could ever ban that. Banning it is just basically the government saying words. They're saying, oh, this is now a law, but there's no enforcement behind it, in the sense that, okay, how are they going to enforce deleting Bitcoin's code from the world? It's obviously just ludicrous even to think about. You can't do that. So on this level, the idea that government can ban Bitcoin is it can just be rejected entirely. Now, a more fair criticism would be, well, the government can go after exchanges. They can shut down exchanges in whatever political jurisdiction that you're talking about. They can make it illegal to buy, and if you're caught buying it, they can throw you in jail. And I mean, let's be fair, that is true. We may say that is it's poor judgment on the part of a government in the long term to they're on the wrong side of history. If you're a government that bans Bitcoin, you're on the wrong side of history in a lot of ways. Not just morally, but economically. But let's say it does happen, right? Governments are very short-sighted. Let's entertain the possibility that, yes, governments can make Bitcoin illegal. It is something you have to consider. Your government might not be thinking rationally. Your government might not be thinking about long-term implications of such a policy. The people who run your government might have no idea what Bitcoin even is. They might have no idea what they're even banning, but they might do it anyways. So let's take the criticism or the threat of government banning Bitcoin at face value. And they may not ban it explicitly. There's other ways of banning it. They can tax it. They can implement 80% tax on capital gains for crypto if they want. They can implement an 80% tax on unrealized gains if they want. There's all sorts of games that the government can play to exert pressure against Bitcoin holders. And I think it's important to realize that, yes, these things are possible. But what I would say is these are not criticisms of Bitcoin. These things, these threats, which you know, they are real, are not inherent to the Bitcoin system or protocol itself. You cannot fault Bitcoin for a government inflicting confiscatory taxes upon you. You cannot fault Bitcoin for a government declaring that you are no longer allowed to exchange your fiat for Bitcoin and banning the exchanges in your country. And by the way, I'm not saying that these policies that amount to banning Bitcoin would be successful. I'm just saying we have to accept that they could be implemented, that is a possibility. That is not to imply that they would work. And my understanding is that in Zimbabwe, both the US dollar and Bitcoin are banned, and there's a black market for both. And apparently the Bitcoin black market is thriving in Zimbabwe. I've mentioned this before, and I think it's important to note that when a government bans something, people stand up and notice, and they look at what was banned and they wonder why. Why would my government ban this thing? I've heard of this thing called Bitcoin before, but now that it's been banned, I maybe need to look into this. And that's the paradox of it. If a government bans Bitcoin, it telegraphs to the citizens that Bitcoin is a form of power that is a threat to the government. And if the citizens decide that their government is a threat to them, then the logical conclusion there is to go to the asset that the government clearly is afraid of. That's the paradox of banning it. You actually strengthen Bitcoin. You create yet another channel for the network of Bitcoin to grow. So all of that is to say, I do not believe that a government ban on Bitcoin in the end ultimately works. I think in most cases, except for perhaps the most extreme and draconian, we're talking gulags. You get caught with Bitcoin, you're thrown in the gulag. Maybe that would work, just in one specific region, but that would require extreme force. That is not a problem with Bitcoin. That is a problem with your government. And you can't just shrug and say, oh well, I guess Bitcoin's been banned. That was fun while it lasted. You can't just say, oh well, the government has confiscated all weapons from the citizenry and now has a total monopoly on power. Oh, that silly government, they're always up to their tricks. No, this is serious business. We're not talking about, municipal tax rates or parking code. We're talking about fundamental freedoms. We're talking about the difference between free men and slaves. We're talking about the difference between the peasant and yeoman farmer. I view the freedom to own Bitcoin to be equivalent to the freedom to self-defense tools and the freedom of speech, the freedom of conscience. If you're not allowed to own Bitcoin, you need to be worried about your ability to speak out against the government. To not become a political prisoner if you criticize a government policy. You need to recognize that if they come after Bitcoin, they are coming after encryption, and they are coming after your self-defense tools. They are coming after your ability to speak your mind, your right to criticize the government. If they ban Bitcoin, they are coming after your privacy. They are coming after your ability to interact with society if you harbor wrongthink and you express it. It's not that Bitcoin is at stake here. It's that if Bitcoin is banned, it's an indication that everything is at stake. The difference between slavery and freedom is at stake. None of this is a problem with Bitcoin. All of this is a problem with your government being oppressive, with your government crushing you under its heel. If your government implements these kind of policies against Bitcoin holders, well, guess what? You have other problems. You have a government that is trampling upon you. That you have a government that treats you like a slave, that treats you like dirt. You have other problems, my friend. This is not just about Bitcoin. This is not, even if you don't hold any Bitcoin, it should be a huge red flag if your government starts to implement policies that are anti-Bitcoin, that make it difficult to buy and hold or exchange or sell Bitcoin. To the extent that your government starts to crack down on Bitcoin, quote unquote, crack down on it, to the extent that your government starts to do this, if they do, then you have other problems. Because if they're willing to do that, if they're willing to treat you like a slave, if they're willing to say that you're not allowed to store the surplus value that you have created, if you're not allowed to store that wherever you choose to store it, if they're willing to say that, oh, you're not allowed to do that, well, that's not the fault of Bitcoin. You live in an oppressive state. And if that's the case, you should not just dump your Bitcoin and say, oh, well, that was fun while it lasted, too bad it didn't work out. No. What you need to be doing, if that's the case, is, for one, just leave. If that's the way that they're going to treat you, if they're going to treat you like dirt, then just leave if you can. And that's one of the reasons why I stress the average common citizen. They need to accumulate as much Bitcoin as they can before the institutions and the big money get in. You need to get in and establish a healthy position, because in the future, if your government decides to play these kind of games, then you have the optionality of saying, no, I'm not putting up with this, and just saying goodbye and just leaving. It's not about Lambos, right? It's not 2013 anymore. This isn't about Lambos. This is about freedom. Things are getting serious, folks. Things are getting really serious. This isn't about materialism or getting rich. This is about accumulating the capital and the means to be able to say to your government when it is oppressive, no, I'm not going to put up with this. I'm leaving. And having the means and the ability to make that happen. To send a message to your government that if you're going to treat your own citizens like this, then you're gone. You're not going to invest any more energy into that system, if that's the case. And you know what else? If that's not a viable option, if just voting with your feet and leaving is not a viable option, if your government is willing to ban Bitcoin and to impose some sort of pseudo confiscation or some sort of insane tax regime against Bitcoin holders, then there needs to be resistance. There needs to be civil disobedience, non-compliance. This would be a situation where widespread non-compliance could have a lot of power behind it. It could send a message. See, what I'm trying to say here is that you can't just say, oh, governments can ban Bitcoin They can tax it into oblivion, blah, blah, blah. You can't just make that criticism and just say, well, I guess that I'm not going to get into Bitcoin, because you're not considering the implications of what you're saying. If your government is willing to do that to you, then that should be not only objectionable, but you should be morally outraged at even the prospect of that occurring. And should it occur, even if you're not a Bitcoin holder, you should be up in arms about this kind of thing. You can't just allow yourself to be trampled upon. There's that expression, slaves don't own guns. I think I really like that expression. There's a lot that is said with that expression. There's a lot of meaning conveyed. Well, I would like to adopt that expression for Bitcoin. Slaves don't own Bitcoin. If you're not allowed to own Bitcoin, you're a slave. Or at least you're being treated like one. And to the extent that you just put up with it, you're just passively accepting your position as a slave. Slaves don't own Bitcoin. Think about that. And think about just how insulting it is if your government ever were to decide to tell you that you cannot store your surplus value in Bitcoin. If it's willing to do that, then that's not a problem with Bitcoin. You have other problems, my friend. You have to... It's no longer about finance. It's no longer about economics or investing. Now you're talking about politics. Now you're talking about oppression of human freedom. Imagine if someone criticized gold back in the 20s, 30s, and so forth in Soviet Russia. Someone said, well, gold is terrible money because the government can just arrest you and send you to the gulag. Well, in that particular historical circumstance, the problem was not gold. The problem was not that gold was confiscated and therefore gold is ridiculous. No, obviously gold was not the problem in Soviet Russia, in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was the problem. So, this is why I push back against this FUD, this government will ban Bitcoin FUD, because even though the government could ban Bitcoin, I don't see this as a reason not to own Bitcoin. Because if you live in a country where you think that's going to happen, or could happen, you really need to consider if they're willing to do that to you in regards to how you save your money. That's all you're trying to do. You're just trying to save your money. You're just trying to put it into a form where it will increase in value over time. You're just looking for a store of value. That's it. That's all. And yet, they're still banning it? Well, you got other problems. If they're willing to do that in that circumstance against you, a Bitcoin holder, what else are they willing to do to you? How free are you? You're not free. You're just a slave. Because slaves aren't allowed to hold Bitcoin.